At first blush, I don't know about you, but as I heard our story from Genesis, I realized it's been a while since I had read it. It's almost easy to think that what God is doing is using diversity as a punishment, right? It's kind of confusing, almost disturbing. Like there's a unity among the people, they're getting things done, they're building things, making a society, and then God apparently doesn't seem to like this, so scatters the people across the face of the earth and confuses their language. Both the details of how this takes place and God's reasoning for doing so are frustratingly sparse, right? Does God not like unity? Is humanity's diversity really nothing more than a punishment? But this knee-jerk interpretation has a long history, actually, of being used by colonizing European nations in the past and white nationalist Americans still to this day to support the subjugation and segregations of people based on those perceived differences, cultural, racial, linguistic. White South African theologians, for instance, they used this very text to justify apartheid, arguing that it clearly reveals, Scripture clearly reveals that God desires to keep separate languages and races apart from one another. It's the plain meaning of the text, right? And yet, I believe nothing could be further from the deeper message of this passage. And certainly on this day, the birth and mission of the church, which is what, again, Pentecost is all about. So how do we read these two texts together from Genesis and Acts? So I want to begin with a fresh hearing of Genesis 11, a text that, like the majority of the Old Testament, wasn't written in the beginning of time, but was written in the context, actually, of Babylonian exile, reflecting on the past. Now, you may recall from previous sermons, if you've been around for a little while, that Babylonia was the great empire of the ancient Mediterranean region. It was technologically advanced and innovative and industrious, right? And if the measure of an empire was based on the degree to which its culture and its language could be imposed upon people of a vast domain and diverse people groups, Babylonia was among the greats of human history. Its military prowess was beyond comparison. The Israelites experienced this firsthand when Babylon invaded Jerusalem and razed the city, its temple, razed their homes to the ground. Entire villages, livestock even wiped out. Families killed or separated. Many of those who survived were taken forcefully as captives into exile in Babylonia, so removed from Jerusalem, taken into the foreign and distant land of their oppressors. And it's this community and their descendants who wrote the story of the Tower of Babel, which is to say that we can't faithfully understand what this passage is about without hearing it from the perspective of those displaced and traumatized people living in exile, living in the land of their mighty oppressors. And when we read it from that vantage point, from those who are caught on the underside of history and its violent forces, well, then it starts to emerge as a harsh critique of the very spirit that animated the Babylonian Empire and all empires throughout history. It's this industrialization fueled by a hubris, a greed, a will to power that would declare, as Genesis does, that nothing they proposed to do would be impossible for them, for they were as gods. The world was theirs to shape as they willed. While the privileged or even middle class in Babylonia surely saw their economic success and their military prowess and civilizing of those backward peoples out there, they saw that as a sign of progress, right? Of those living on the underside of history, however. These displaced Israelites, they knew better. This wasn't progress. They knew that a unity fueled by industrialization, that is, being a melting pot with a diverse labor pool working to advance the agenda of the powerful, that will never be enough. Right? Working in the same company is not the same as being treated or viewed as equal. Seeing difference or diversity as an asset merely because it will increase profitability or enhance a company's image is not the same as building beloved community, whose foundation is the inherent dignity and value of each person's and the gifts that they offer to reshape the world. That might be the spirit of empire, a spirit that continues to animate our world, and sadly all too often animates churches. But this is not the spirit of God. And it's not the spirit of the first church born on Pentecost. So in Genesis 11, God is not creating diversity as a punishment for being so united as to accomplish a whole lot. Rather, it's a subversive description of the spirit of Babylon. It's a powerful rebuke of the ways that unity largely remains a facade. It's empty rhetoric. There's no real unity because that cultural and linguistic diversity are not really celebrated. It's not actually welcome to reshape the community. It's just used to fuel the industrialization and agenda of those with power. And so the scattering and diversifying of people's speech is God's way of breaking into the world, of disrupting this false spirit of unity embraced by the empire and saying enough of business as usual. Pentecost and this morning's reading from Acts 2 are a bold reaffirmation of this God and the ways that she moves in and through our world. Right? It pushes the story even further because it proclaims that the Spirit of God powers a radical reordering of the world such that the world's rich diversity is not merely an economic incentive, but the very way in which we come to know more and more of who God is, and therefore who God is calling us to become. Right? There's so much we miss when we settle for that false unity of tokenism or merely tolerating each other's differences. When we settle for having one or two faces or viewpoints that look or sound different than our own, but never actually engage the experiences underneath them. We never allow the diversity of other folks to challenge or even change our own perspectives. And in fact, what this scripture is saying in Acts 2 is that we can only come to know and experience God when we do allow those of others to inform and reshape us. When we as a church don't merely expect new folks to assimilate into how we've always done it, but rather open ourselves to the Spirit's radical reordering of who we are and who we are becoming. Because our work here as the church is not merely to create a church that perpetuates itself into the future. Right? None of the churches that you read about in Scripture, in the New Testament, none of those churches exist today. Our goal is not to build a church that continues into the future in whatever form, but to build the church of the future. The point in listing the many nations, the diversity represented at Pentecost, is God's way of declaring that God's vision for the first church and the church of the future is one whose dominant culture is overturned in favor of a multicultural one. In contrast to the Israelites' experience in Babylon, where people of many nations and tongues were united merely through their labor, through their exploitation, right? But their diversity was suppressed in favor of being assimilated into the dominant culture's way of life. In contrast to this, the first church of Pentecost is a church where the Spirit of God enabled a different kind of unity. A unity that highlighted and centered their differences. Did you see how much it emphasized how astounding it was, which is what made it all the more confusing. Again, 5 times our passage in those short verses, 20 verses, 5 times our passage repeats their amazement, concluding that they simply must be drunk. There's no good explanation for what is happening. But instead, the Spirit that gave birth to the church on Pentecost is one that reorients us to see that every aspect of human diversity, every tongue and cultural difference, every sexuality and gender identity and gender expression, that these are not obstacles to overcome. They're doorways, they're portals through which we discover more of God's Spirit, of God's presence, through which we discover more of who God is. It's not enough to be inclusive, to be all together in one place, to say, all are welcome here. Which church doesn't say that, right? It's not enough to be a melting pot. The Spirit that gave birth to the church insists that the culture of our community must wholeheartedly draw in and draw on the wisdom of our unique differences. Our worship, our spaces, our programming, what we do, who we seek to become, must be created with and for those who have been silenced and erased for far too long. Because to merely tolerate each other for the sake of perpetuating the church or for the sake of industry, to expect others to assimilate into who we are without ourselves being changed in the process, that is to rebuild the Tower of Babel all over again. And we know how God felt about that. But to gather across our differences, as difficult and even divisive as that can be at times, to listen to each other, to grieve with each other, to lay down our lives for our enemies. To do so is to understand a fuller picture of God. Now, as always with our faith, the placement of these seemingly supernatural stories in a specific historical context, rather than once upon a time, is to emphasize that the Spirit of God seeks to break into history, seeks to meet us here and now with the gift and the threat of new life. This isn't just a fanciful once upon a time story and we think, well, that was interesting and cool once upon a time, but nothing for now. No, this is to emphasize that God in every time and place seeks to encounter us with the gift and the threat of new life, filling and animating us, comforting us where we need comforting, and provoking, disrupting us where we've become complacent. Everywhere that life threatens to break forth, resisting those forces of dehumanization and death. Everywhere that you see the insistence of the inherent goodness of each person, there the liberating, transforming Spirit of God is at work. That's what it looks like. And here I proclaim to you, Federated Church, that the church of the future, if there is to be a church with any vitality, a church worth its salt in the future, must become as the first church of Pentecost. Ever melted, ever remolded, and born anew in unexpected ways. It must focus its energy not primarily on perpetuating itself, but on being empowered by the liberating, confusing, astonishing Spirit of God. Because here's the thing, the scriptures insist that the same Spirit, the same power that raised Christ from the dead lives in us. The same Spirit that bewildered and awed and astonished those gathered in Jerusalem on that first Pentecost with its power to to reshape a segregated community into a new one united across its diversity. This same Spirit, this same power seeks to reshape us. Such a movement would be no less bewildering in our polarized world than it was back then. People might even start grumbling about us, as they did with the disciples. These aren't faithful people of God. Were they drunk? Something must be in the water over there at Federated. No, friends, we're not drunk. This is simply what the prophets promised would happen if we dared to truly open ourselves to being led by God's Spirit rather than, well, personal preferences or powerful personalities or agendas. Right, this may sound strange coming from a pastor, but I actually think that the number of churches truly led by God's Spirit, despite numbering in the, tens or hundreds of thousands here in the United States, the actual number of churches being led in this way is pretty few. And yet, though not without our missteps, my own as well as others, if I can be so bold as to say so myself, out of the ashes of the past 2 years, I believe that this is exactly what is happening here at Federated Church. Among us, through us. That it was this same Spirit animating us when a small group reading and praying and talking together during Lent in March of 2020 about what it looks like to live out our faith, to fall upward when the world falls apart. That led us to create a mutual aid fund which raised $20,000, 90% of which, through trusted community partnerships, went to those members of our community who are undocumented, who didn't receive a stimulus check. In a time of crisis and polarization, we stood alongside some of those members in our community who are most vulnerable to help ensure that they could pay for their rent, their utilities, their groceries, their medical bills, rather than merely focus on our expensive roof repairs. Not that those don't matter. It was this same Spirit that at a moment's notice led to a new community partnership, or a variety of them, like the one with the community gardens, and people ready to serve, and we served thousands, even when the risk of gathering to do so early on was still a little uncertain. Was it safe to do it? And yet we knew that we had to do something, to rise in that historic moment. And it was this same Spirit that led us to partner with Safe Passage and the Queer-Oriented Rural Resource Network this spring to host a Queers and Allies community blood drive, not only generating life-saving blood during this historic blood shortage, but also as a bold witness to the wider community that when we say all are welcome here, we mean it. And though we're not perfect, we're continually working to live that welcome out, to keep practicing it like calisthenics, like exercises, to make those muscles stronger. And there are a number of more things that I could say as I think back on the past couple of years, the ways that I believe that the Spirit of God is rebirthing us as a church. But the real question before us today and in the days ahead is, will we continue to open ourselves? Individually, as a church, as a society, will we continue to open ourselves to this Spirit's promptings? As uncomfortable, as disorienting, as bewildering, as astonishing as they might be at times. Will we continue to take risks for the sake of the mission that God has given us, to step boldly into this new future into which God is calling us? reimagining what it means to be the church from the ground up? Or will we seek to merely perpetuate what once was? Or as Arundhati Roy asks, when conflict arises, will we revert to our old ways? Choose to drag the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies, our defunct systems and structures. Friends, the church of the future is that which is willing to follow the unexpected, uncomfortable, disorienting promptings of the Spirit of God, knowing that doing so is our only hope for healing and flourishing. And not only ours, but the healing and flourishing of all the world. May it be so. Amen.